getting into the urinary system, and so many of you rightly predicted one of the major functions of the kidneys, but we want to understand that the kidneys are a very complex organ system, and they have a lot of complex functions beyond just waste removal, beyond just excretion and filtration of the blood. And so we're going to start our discussion of the renal system by identifying the many functions and the several different components of the entire urinary system. So it is going to help us regulate our plasma ion concentration. And this is basically how much sodium or potassium exists in our plasma. That's another function that the kidneys help in. It's going to regulate our blood volume and blood pressure. So blood volume is essentially the amount of blood, the amount of plasma that is circulating in our vessels, and by extension, the amount of hydrostatic pressure or blood pressure that is being exerted by that plasma. It's also going to stabilize our blood pH. So because it can absorb and secrete hydrogen ions and bicarbonate, it's going to help us balance the acidity and the alkalinity of our blood, which is the blood pH. It's going to prevent the loss of valuable nutrients. So things like glucose are reabsorbed and preserved via the proximal parts of the kidneys. Amino acids, which can be reconstructed to make new proteins, are also preserved and reabsorbed via the kidneys. And so it's going to prevent us from losing some of those valuable nutrients and nutritive substances from being lost in the urine as they are being filtered through the blood. It's also going to help us eliminate organic matter. And so when we talk about organic matter, we're thinking of some of the byproducts of cellular respiration. So we can, or just breakdown of food materials in general. Nitrogen is one of the main forms of that organic matter, where every time we eat protein in our diet and we break that down, we release nitrogen, and that has to be eliminated from the body. It's also going to synthesize calcitrol, which is the active form of vitamin D. And so we think about vitamin D, we can supplement it, which is cholecalciferol, also known as vitamin D3. We can also have it activated in the skin under the influence of UV exposure. But in order to turn that into vitamin D, which is the active form, so from D3 to D, we need the kidneys. And the kidneys are important in synthesizing that calcitrol, which is the active form. So supplementing vitamin D all you want and you don't have proper kidney function, you will still have poor vitamin D levels. It's also going to help in preventing dehydration. So again, connecting to the second point here with regulating blood volume and blood pressure, the kidneys help us to reserve water. They're going to help us to regulate our blood volume, which is regulating the amount of fluid that's circulating in our system, and also preventing us from being dehydrated by losing excess amounts of fluid into the urine. And then lastly here, the kidneys aid the liver in some of its vital functioning. So the kidneys and the liver usually work hand in hand. They both help in terms of erythrocyte production and recycling, which we talked a lot about in one of our previous units. They also help in terms of our metabolic activity. So this is going to be the active point for hormones such as thyroid hormone, T3 and T4. So they're both going to help with that metabolic regulation. And so the kidneys and the liver function together in a lot of different aspects, and we'll talk a lot more about that going forward too. So in addition to all that you've said, I want you to have an understanding that the kidneys are not only involved in waste production. That's kind of the main point or the main function that we associate with kidneys or the renal system in general, but they also have a lot of other important functions that aid in overall homeostasis, right? The acidity of our blood, the blood volume, and so on. So this whole packet, we're really going to get into the anatomy of the kidneys and the urinary system. So what are the structures involved, and just kind of introducing some of the functional aspects. But we're going to spend the remaining packets really getting into the process of urine production. And so we're starting off here by looking at the components of the urinary system. So we've got the kidneys. And if you're a normal, healthy, functioning adult, you've got 2 healthy kidneys, but you can be functioning on 1 kidney. The kidneys are just that amazing. You can have 1 kidney and be okay, so to speak. The kidneys are also associated with the functional units, which are called the nephrons. So these are the really tiny structures within the kidneys that are what help to fine tune and filter blood to create urine. We've also got the ureters as associated structures here. The ureters are communicating from the kidneys so that urine that is being produced by the nephrons within the kidney can then be sent down to the bladder. So the urinary bladder is pretty much just a holding tank or a storage unit for our urine until it's time to be voided from the body. And then we've got the urethra, which is the exiting channel. So it's going from the bladder, exiting into the urethral orifice where that urine can be voided and can leave the body. All right. So we've got the bladders with the the kidneys with the nephrons inside. We've got the ureters, 2 of them coming from each kidney. We've got a single bladder and a single urethra. Getting a little bit more into the anatomy here, the right kidney has some interesting connections to some other anatomical structures. So it's covered by the liver. It's also coming into close contact with the hepatic flexure, sometimes called the right colic flexure. So this is the bend of the colon, the right side of the colon. It's usually in this region here. We've also got the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. And we'll introduce these structures a lot more in lab, but just to talk about how they come into contact with both of our kidneys. And so the right kidney is going to be pushed a little bit lower because of this contact that is making with the liver. So because the liver is this large organ in the right upper quadrant, it's going to slightly push that right kidney a little bit lower than the left. The left kidney comes into contact with the spleen. So the spleen is usually up in the upper left quadrant. It also comes into contact with the stomach, which is sort of centrally, but sort of leftward located, the pancreas as well, the splenic flexure, which is sometimes called the left colic flexure, which is the left bend of the colon, as well as the jejunum, which is the second part of the small intestine. Okay, and this will probably make, again, a lot more sense when you look at these structures in lab. But because of this interaction, we want to think about these, the way that the kidneys are going to be located because of these interactions with other structures. Now, both kidneys are capped with the suprarenal glands, and you can kind of see that in this image here. The suprarenal glands, sometimes called the adrenal glands, is where we have the production of our adrenal hormones, so epinephrine and norepinephrine from the medulla. And then we also have some other hormones being released from the cortex that we talked about in the endocrine system as well. Yeah, and so that's kind of the anatomy of our kidneys here, the right being slightly lower than the left, both of them having this small triangular shaped gland located at the superior pole of the kidney itself. Now, looking a little bit closer at the structure of the kidneys, there are 3 layers of connective tissue that protect the kidneys. So the kidneys are not within the peritoneal cavity. And if you're looking at this image here, this dark space is what's called the peritoneal cavity. It's very similar to the pericardial sac. It's very similar to the pleural sac, right? The sacs that cover the heart and lungs respectively. And very similar in that it has that double-walled membrane. It's got that visceral layer that is coming in contact with the organs, and then the parietal layer that's coming in contact with the abdominal wall. Now, the kidneys are not within that layer, and so they're usually exposed to additional injury because they're outside of the peritoneal cavity. And so it does call on some additional structures to house and protect the kidneys from any type of external injury. So it's got the fibrous capsule. So the fibrous capsule is going to be wrapping around the kidney, right? Immediately coming in contact with the kidney itself. That is then covered by the perinephric fat. So the perinephric fat is this thin layer of fat here that is outside of the fibrous capsule. And then we have the renal fascia. So the renal fascia is another thin layer of connective tissue that is really found on the anterior surface of the kidney. It's going to be the posterior part of the peritoneal cavity, right? So we've got the renal fascia, really only the anterior surface of the kidney is covered by renal fascia. We've got the paranephrine fat, which is that fatty layer all around the kidney. And then we've got the closely or intimately adhered fibrous capsule. And these structures, again, help to protect the kidney in lieu of it being within that peritoneal cavity or peritoneal sac. Now, looking at some other anatomy here, now the kidneys are located right up against the posterior abdominal wall, as we pointed out on that previous slide. So we can see them here. And in actuality, when you open up the abdominal cavity, you're going to have to remove the fat. You're going to have to remove all of the abdominal organs or the stomach, intestines, all of that to get right to the back here to see where the kidneys are located. At the central or medial part of the kidneys, we have the hilum. So the hilum is this indentation where we've got the vessels coming in or exiting, depending on which vessel we're speaking about. We've also got the ureters, which are communicating down to the bladder. So we have the renal artery, which is bringing oxygenated blood toward the kidney. We've got the renal vein that is taking away blood back toward the inferior vena cava. And then we have the ureters, which are at the bottom, which are going down toward the bladder. Right. So someone's asking me to clarify, are the kidneys not in the peritoneum or are they just deep inside it? So they are in the abdominal cavity. They're deep in the back of the abdominal cavity, close up against the posterior abdominal wall, but they are not within the peritoneal sac or the peritoneum. Okay, just to clarify that. So this would be the posterior layer of the peritoneal cavity that is coming against the anterior part of the kidney, but the kidneys are not within the peritoneum, if that makes sense. Continuing on here, let's look at some of the microscopic structure. So if we were to cut the kidney in half, right, this frontal section right down the middle of the kidney, we would be able to see the main distinction of the two major regions of the kidney. So we've got the outer pale staining region called the cortex. And the cortex is where we have the proximal and distal convoluted tubules. So some of the nephron structures that I'll mention again a little bit later on. And we can distinguish that from the medulla. And the medulla is sort of the deeper part of the kidney, and it is a lot darker in its appearance than the cortex. So that's another sort of obvious difference between these two regions, is just the color of how they appear. So looking at this gross kidney here, we can see the darker, deeper staining region that is sort of centrally located. And then we've got the outer paler staining region or paler appearing region, which is the cortex. Now within the cortex, we've got some of the more important structures here. We've got the renal pyramids. So these triangular shaped parts of the kidneys, which are formed by the loops of Henle. We're going to talk a lot about the loops of Henle, but these are the structures that form the renal pyramids. We've also got the renal columns, and these are these adjacent structures in between the renal pyramids here. So these central sort of lighter staining regions that are also still a part of the medulla, but they're running in between the pyramids, are called the renal columns. And then we've got the renal papillae. The renal papillae are the projections of the pyramids towards the minor calyces, okay? So these pointy projections of the pyramids themselves are called the renal papilla. We also want to think about the renal lobe. So kind of centrally located here, moving more towards the ureters, we've got the minor calyx, which is just the part of the calyx that's coming from the renal papilla. So that's the main connecting duct that's draining that initial part of the urine. That will then communicate to some larger branches called the major calyx or the major calyces. And then that will then communicate to the renal pelvis, which is the opening towards the ureter. Okay, so just to go over that again one more time, we've got the renal pyramids, these central structures here, the renal columns, these adjacent columns in between, the renal papilla or papillae, which are the pointy projections of the renal pyramids, that then communicates to the minor calyx, which is the opening of the calycal structures, which are the ducts that drain urine. Then that communicates to the major calyx, or the larger branches of that duct. That communicates to the renal pelvis, which directly opens into the ureter.